Daily oral hygiene in medieval Europe. When we imagine hygiene in the Middle Ages, images of unwashed bodies, dirty streets, and complete disregard for self-care often arise in our imagination. However, in reality, the situation was not so clear. This is especially true for dental and oral care. Despite the lack of modern dental technology, the inhabitants of Europe in the Middle Ages had their own methods, habits, and means that allowed them to maintain relative dental health. The first place to start is with the everyday ideas of a medieval person about cleanliness. Although sanitary conditions, especially in cities, left much to be desired, people got used to a certain routine of hygiene procedures from an early age. One of these rituals was the morning cleansing of the mouth. After waking up, as a rule, a person rinsed his mouth with cool water. This was done to freshen the breath and wake up the body. In some cases, herbal decoctions such as sage, rosemary, thyme, or mint could be added to the water. Such additives not only gave the water a taste and aroma, but also had disinfecting properties. Brushing teeth as such was not alien to Europeans. Of course, toothbrushes in the modern sense were out of the question then. However, people used improvised materials. Fabric, threads, twigs, linen or cotton pieces of cloth were rolled into a tight tourniquet and rubbed against their teeth, trying to remove plaque. Sometimes such a cloth was soaked with herbal infusions or salt. Wealthier people could use specially made rags designed only for this purpose. Another popular method of oral care was the use of chewing sticks. In the East, already in the early Middle Ages, miswak was used, a twig of a certain tree, the tip of which was chewed until the fibers formed. In Europe, soft and fragrant branches of willow, hazel, and fruit trees were used in a similar way. Such sticks played the role of both a toothbrush and natural chewing gum. Chewing them stimulated salivation, helped to clean the teeth of food debris and freshen the breath. Toothpicks, although less common, also existed. They were made of wood, bones, or even metal. They were often simple pointed sticks. Sometimes such items were carried with them in special cases. Their use was rather the prerogative of the nobility, since such small devices were rare in the peasant environment. Rinsing the mouth after eating was another habit that seemed to bring a medieval person closer to a modern one. People understood that leftovers in the mouth can become a source of unpleasant odors and diseases. Therefore, even simple water accessible to the majority became a means of maintaining hygiene. In addition to mechanical cleansing, people sought to improve their bad breath. All kinds of spices and herbs were used: mint, parsley, cloves, coriander, bay leaf. They were not only added to food, but also chewed separately. This helped to neutralize unpleasant odors and at the same time had a slight antiseptic effect. It is important to note that the ideas about beauty and dental health in the Middle Ages differed significantly from modern ones. A snow-white smile was not considered a standard. On the contrary, excessively white teeth could be perceived as a sign of vernacular origin. Noble ladies and gentlemen sometimes even painted their teeth in dark tones to emphasize their belonging to high society. Some sources mention the use of ash-based formulations or herbs that gave teeth a darker shade. One can also find an explanation for the relatively good dental condition in the eating habits of the medieval population. First of all, there was much less sugar in the diet of Europeans than in subsequent centuries. Sweets were rare and only available at feasts and celebrations. The food was based on cereals, dairy products, vegetables, and meat. Such food, especially coarse and unpeeled, contributed to the natural cleaning of teeth during chewing. It is also worth mentioning the special hygienic traditions of monasteries and clergy. Monks in some orders adhered to a strict regime of personal cleanliness, including regular washing and body care. Within the framework of these rules, there could also be prescriptions for oral care. In addition, medical treatises, including those related to hygiene, were preserved and copied in monasteries. This contributed to the dissemination of knowledge among a limited but influential circle of people. Thus, contrary to popular myths, there was a daily culture of oral care in medieval Europe. Despite limited resources and modest knowledge in the field of anatomy and microbiology, people intuitively and empirically developed methods to maintain healthy teeth and gums. These methods varied depending on social status, region, and cultural traditions, but they had one thing in common: the desire to keep clean and avoid diseases. This proves that even in the Dark Ages, people aspired to hygiene, albeit in forms far from modern ones. Daily oral care in medieval Europe. Contrary to the widespread myth about the complete lack of hygiene in the Middle Ages, the Europeans of those times had their own oral care system. Of course, it was very different from the modern one. There were no toothbrushes in their usual form, pastes, antiseptics, or dental offices. Nevertheless, people tried to keep their teeth healthy and avoid bad breath by using everything that was available in their daily lives, from improvised materials to folk recipes. Morning rituals. How the day started. The day in the medieval house started early, and immediately after waking up, many people paid attention to cleansing their mouths. The easiest way was to rinse with cold water. It was believed that cold water strengthens teeth, gives them strength, and protects them from destruction. This method was popular among both commoners and people of religious rank. Monks, for example, followed strict routines that included morning ablution. People used rags instead of toothbrushes. Most often it was a rough piece of linen cloth, which was used to rub teeth and gums. Sometimes such a cloth was chewed, turning its fibers into a kind of soft brush. This rag cleaning simultaneously massaged the gums and removed plaque from the teeth. Some even rubbed their teeth with fragrant herbs or leaves to give their breath freshness. Many peasants and townspeople chewed on the branches of certain trees. Branches with a fibrous structure, such as willow or hazel, were especially appreciated. These sticks were chewed until one end fluffed up and turned into a kind of brush. Then they brushed their teeth with this fluffed end. The Eastern tradition of using the miswak, a chewing stick made from Salvadora persica wood, also penetrated into Europe, especially through contacts with the Arab world during the era of the Crusades. After eating, it is mandatory to rinse. One of the most versatile and affordable ways to care for the oral cavity was rinsing after meals. People used ordinary water, sometimes with the addition of salt, vinegar, or herbal decoctions. This helped not only to freshen the breath, but also to remove the stuck remnants of food, especially from the interdental spaces. Salt water has also been considered a means to strengthen the gums and fight inflammation. To clean the teeth even more thoroughly, we used sharp wooden toothpicks. In wealthy families, such tools could be made of metal or even bone, sometimes with decorative trim. The commoners were content with ordinary splinters or thin twigs. They carefully cleaned the space between the teeth, removing food debris and plaque. Tooth powders and pastes. Homemade recipes. Since toothpaste as such did not yet exist, it was replaced by powders that were prepared at home or purchased from pharmacists. Such powders could be very different in composition, but they were always based on abrasive and aromatic components. One of the most common recipes was ash powder, which was most often ash from vines or fruit trees. It was ground to a fine state and other ingredients were added: chalk, burnt salt, crushed marble, or even tile powder. All these components had a high degree of abrasiveness and effectively removed plaque. But on the other hand, they could damage the enamel with frequent use. Paste-like mixtures were sometimes used instead of powder. For example, a mixture of honey with salt and a drop of vinegar was considered popular. This paste not only cleansed teeth, but also had an anti-inflammatory effect. Such products also included aromatic herbs such as mint, sage, rosemary, cloves, as well as oils, such as clove or lavender oil, that give the paste a pleasant smell and enhance the antiseptic effect. Folk methods of combating bad breath. The freshness of breath in the Middle Ages was of great importance. People understood that bad breath could be a sign of illness, poor nutrition, or even a character defect. Therefore, there were many ways to freshen your breath. One of the simplest methods is chewing aromatic herbs and spices. The most popular were mint, parsley, thyme, rosemary, as well as cloves and anise. These plants not only freshened the breath, but also stimulated salivation, which had a beneficial effect on oral health. There were also more exotic recipes. For example, to eliminate an unpleasant odor, it was recommended to chew a mixture of honey and crushed ginger or drink infusions based on wormwood and sage. The monasteries also prepared special mouthwashes, decoctions of oak bark, sage, and mint. Bad breath in folk medicine was associated not only with poor hygiene, but also with internal ailments. It was believed that the stench could come from inside, from a spoiled liver, poor digestion, or an excess of black bile. Therefore, diets were often recommended along with rinses: more bread and vegetables, less fatty meat and alcohol. The social importance of oral cleanliness. It is important to note that the attitude towards dental care was not limited to medical or purely hygienic motives. In the Middle Ages, personal hygiene was often an indicator of morality and good manners. This was especially true for women and people of religious rank. Monastic statutes sometimes contained direct instructions. Nuns and monks were required to keep their bodies and mouths clean so as not to tempt their neighbors with stench. Nevertheless, the aesthetics of a smile in the Middle Ages differed significantly from modern ones. White teeth have not always been considered the standard of beauty. In certain periods, especially among the nobility, on the contrary, darkened, imperfect teeth were perceived as a sign of nobility and wealth. Some even artificially stained their teeth or covered them with paints to give them a more noble shade. Thus, oral care in medieval Europe was an integral part of everyday life, although it was very different from modern concepts. People used cloths, sticks, powders, decoctions, and herbs in an effort to keep their teeth healthy and their breath fresh. Folk traditions, Oriental borrowings, medical knowledge, and religious beliefs were intricately intertwined in this care. Despite the primitive means, medieval Europeans already understood the importance of mouth care, both from the point of view of health and in the context of social life. From the devil to the tongs, superstitions, faith, and folk methods of dental care. The Middle Ages in Europe is not just about knights, castles, and the Inquisition. It is also a completely unique fusion of everyday life, where body care, including oral care, was closely intertwined with religious beliefs, fears, legends, and magical thinking. The topic of dental health was no exception. On the contrary, she was at the intersection of physiology and metaphysics, pain and hope, flesh and spirit. People tried to maintain hygiene, although they often understood it differently than we do today. They lived in a different worldview, where bad breath could be a sign of both physical illness and sin. Superstitions and religious explanations of toothache. In the Middle Ages, illness did not just cause suffering. It was often considered a punishment for sins or a manifestation of evil forces. This was especially true of toothache. Excruciating, piercing, it almost mysteriously possessed a person, made it difficult to eat, talk, sleep. It is not surprising that the explanation of the cause of such pain was sought not only in physiology, but also in the supernatural. It was believed that a toothworm could settle in a diseased tooth, a small, evil creature that chews through the enamel and causes suffering. Many troubles were attributed to this worm, and in order to expel it, people resorted to enchanted herbs, prayers, spells, and rituals. Sometimes garlic, onions, and spices were put in the tooth, not only for disinfection, but also to smoke out the spirit of the disease. The religious context played a huge role. The most famous dental saint was Saint Apollonia, a martyr who, according to legend, had all her teeth pulled out by pagans with tongs. She was considered the patroness of all those suffering from toothache. People turned to her with prayers, put candles, wore her images on themselves, kept amulets in the form of dental forceps at home to protect themselves from pain. Sometimes believers put handwritten prayers under their pillows and slept on them, hoping that the text would bring relief. In some regions of Europe, special prayers from the tooth were distributed, passed down from generation to generation. They were whispered by putting their palms to their cheeks when the pain started. Magical amulets could also be bought in the markets. Pieces of metal wrapped in cloth, wooden crosses, consecrated sticks that had to be chewed for toothache. In some cases, a ritual of pain transmission was used in villages. A person with a bad tooth had to take an iron nail, whisper a spell on it, then touch it to the gum and drive it into a tree. It was believed that the pain would pass into the tree and disappear from the body. Folk recipes, from herbs to ashes. Along with religious and mystical methods, traditional medicine was actively used. It was especially important to eliminate bad breath. In the Middle Ages, the freshness of breath was associated not only with hygiene, but also with morality. An unpleasant odor was considered a sign of either illness or promiscuity. Therefore, people were actively looking for ways to freshen their breath. Chewing spices and herbs were widely used. Cloves, mint, rosemary, anise, coriander, cumin, dill. They were chewed after meals, put under the tongue before meals, and carried around in pouches around their necks. Surprisingly, even such modern habits as chewing gum have medieval roots. People chewed tree resin, bark, pieces of cloth soaked in oils, as well as special aromatic pills, candied herbal lumps that slowly dissolved in their mouths. As for toothache, it was treated with the means available in the house. It was believed that compresses of hot salt or sage decoction applied to the cheek could relieve the pain. Decoctions of chamomile, St. John's wort, and sage were taken inside, not so much as analgesics, but as a general sedative. Sometimes the cavity of a diseased tooth was filled with powder from charcoal, ashes, crushed bones, ground minerals, or even ashes of sacred herbs. The most radical remedies included the use of alcohol and toxic substances. Some barbers recommended dripping turpentine, vinegar, or burning tinctures into the tooth to burn out the worm. There were also more sophisticated recipes. A mixture of vinegar, salt, and burnt animal horns, infused in the sun. They rinsed their mouths with it. Sometimes breadcrumbs soaked in wine or garlic paste were applied to the inflamed gum. All this was accompanied by ritual words, prayers, and incantations, instruments, and primitive dentistry. By the Middle Ages, the first beginnings of dental instruments appeared. Barbers and doctors had forceps, similar to pliers, which were used to remove diseased teeth. Such procedures were performed without anesthesia, in conditions that were, to put it mildly, non-sterile. The patient simply sat down on a bench, held himself by his knees, and the doctor's assistants held him by the shoulders. Sometimes the patient was allowed to bite a leather strap or a wooden stick to keep from screaming. There were also tongs with serrated ends to firmly grip the destroyed root. After removal, ashes or salt were poured into the wound, believing that this would speed up healing. Surprisingly, prosthetics were already practiced in the 14th to 15th centuries. If a tooth fell out, it could be replaced with an animal tooth or even a tooth of a deceased person. These teeth were attached with gold or linen threads to the neighboring ones. Sometimes wooden or bone inserts were used. It was painful and uncomfortable, but it reflected the desire to preserve the appearance and functionality. At the same time, prototypes of toothbrushes began to spread. Twigs with chewed ends, brushes with animal bristles, sticks wrapped in cloth. The rich could order a brush from a master, made of ivory or with a silver handle. The commoners were content with rags and fingers. Cleansing was performed in the morning and after meals, sometimes using ashes, finely ground salt, or herbal powder. Aesthetics and status. How teeth reflected social status. Interestingly, teeth in the Middle Ages had not only a functional significance, but also a social connotation. The white teeth indicated a simple origin, because the peasants ate coarse, low-sweet food and had less decayed teeth. The aristocracy, eating delicacies, suffered from tooth decay and lost teeth at a young age. At some point, this became an aesthetic norm. Black, rotten teeth indicated a high status. Some ladies even rubbed their teeth with paint to give them an aristocratic look. The contrast between real health and cultural perception was striking. Thus, teeth became not just a part of the body, but bearers of symbols. They spoke about status, piety, health, and observance of rituals. They could be hidden, displayed, or substituted to meet the expectations of society. Conclusion: medieval hygiene between reason and faith. Medieval Europe was not a kingdom of illiteracy and filth, as it is often portrayed in popular culture. People tried to take care of themselves, took care of the health of their mouths and teeth, and used everything at their disposal, from tobacco and ashes to prayers and incantations. Brushing teeth, fighting odor, and treating pain were all present in everyday life. Although the methods were far from modern standards, the very idea of maintaining hygiene was already firmly rooted in culture. You can laugh at how people rubbed their teeth with soot or drove nails into an oak tree to relieve pain. But behind these actions was the desire to control their body, alleviate suffering, and survive in a world full of uncertainty. Medieval dentistry is a story of search, between science and magic, between pain and hope. And it was in these searches that the understanding of hygiene was born, which became the basis of future medicine.